Hi, welcome to Kidsworld. This is a news program for kids. All the news is reported by kids, and most of the ideas for the stories come from kids. Kidsworld correspondent Laura Hammond goes to see with other kids to watch for whales in the Atlantic Ocean. In San Diego, California, correspondent Tim Stafford reports from a special theater. 8- and 9-year-old kids are learning acting.
In Chicago, correspondent Michael Pitts talks with Walter Payton of the Chicago Bears.
You set the all-time single-game rushing record. How do it feel to do that?
The best part of a record is the work to get there.
And in Missouri, we'll meet some great kid athletes called the St. Louis Zips.
This video is brought to you by Patreon. Patreon! And now, the news. The common narrative for Nickelodeon is that, for its first 5 years, it was boring, stodgy, out of touch, and then Jerry Laybourne took over, and then, like flicking a light switch, everything changed, and Nickelodeon became a huge success. I hope that Knacks has provided a more real and complex narrative, that there was value in the Silver Ball era of Nickelodeon, that the Orange Splat era of Nickelodeon had as many mistakes as it had successes, and that things didn't change overnight. It was a gradual, granular transition. And even here, in 1990, the beginning of the so-called Golden Era, there were still echoes of Silver Ball era sensibilities. Case in point, on October 1st, 1990, Nickelodeon premiered the most Silver Ball-y of shows since Going Great. However, Nick didn't actually expect anyone to watch it. Confused? Then let's dive in. This is Kidsworld.
Hi, I'm Amy Letts from Evansville, Indiana. Let's return to Kidsworld for this interview.
I'm in Hollywood with Ted Lange, who we all know as Isaac from The Love Boat. Do you really go on cruises?
Yep, once a year, David, we get together and we go out on a cruise. Like this year, we went to Australia. I just got back about a week ago. And we went to the Fiji Islands and had a lot of fun.
Kidsworld was, quite literally, old news. A half-hour children's news magazine program, the show originated in network syndication in September of 1976 and ran up through 1985, meaning that the newest episodes available were already 5 years old when Nickelodeon picked it up. Imagine if MTV started rerunning half-decade-old episodes of 60 Minutes. It's kind of like that. The central conceit of Kidsworld, the reason it might appeal to Nickelodeon sensibilities, is that these human interest segments were reported on by actual children. There were children hosts taking news anchor roles, leading into stories with children narrating, or children interviewing actors or athletes. It was a very for kids by kids kind of show 3 years before Nickelodeon even existed.
The news is reported by kids all across America.
Most of the story ideas come from kids.
This week on Kidsworld, I'll report on a theater group run by kids, the Philadelphia Children's Theater.
We'll meet Alfonso Ribeiro from Silver Spoon.
I'll report on my brother's success and ambitions in his favorite sport, gymnastics.
And a bunch of other stuff.
And that's all you can really say about it as a show. It has no consistent cast, for reasons we'll get into. It had no real inventive segments. It was just kids pretending to run a news show, and Nickelodeon bought some reruns. I have a lot of clips from various points in the show's run, and there's a few interesting interviews here and there with like Kiss or Caitlyn Jenner, but most of it's just profiling school bands or sports teams.
Now we're going to try for 2 things right in here.
Mr. Warren Muchmore is the assistant director of the band. He writes the music and the marching drill for the field show.
Up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, ready to go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, go. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, fine.
And a lot of these local profile segments wouldn't have aired on Nickelodeon anyway. Again, for reasons we'll get into. In fact, it's not entirely clear what part of Kidsworld aired on Nickelodeon. Unfortunately, no recordings from the Nickelodeon broadcast have turned up, thanks in part to the show airing at 6:30 in the morning. We've talked before about the dreaded 6 a.m. time slots, where shows go to die, a time when kids are either still asleep or getting ready for school and are too busy to watch TV. The best you could hope for were early bird homeschooled kids, so when a show ended up this early, it usually meant the show was on the way out. And Kidsworld premiered in this time slot. Again, for reasons we'll get into. If it's not clear by now, this is a case where the story around the show is way more interesting than the show itself.
Hi, I'm Bob Beherens. My wife Betsy and I produced the Kidsworld series, and we're here at Videotape Associates in Fort Lauderdale, Florida on the Kidsworld set.
Husband and wife, Robert and Betsy Beherens, had already been in the television business for 2 decades. Bob had gotten his start in 1956 as the host of a local teenage dance show in the vein of American Bandstand, then became the vice president of sales for Official Films, a syndicator of theatrical cartoons for television. He and Betsy formed their own distribution company, simply named Beherens Company, in 1964 out of Miami. The couple didn't want to just distribute, they wanted to make shows to sell nationally in syndication, and they wanted to focus on kids. One of their first attempts was called Kid Stuff, 3.5-minute comedy films starring children, with premises like a boy runs away and joins a circus, and kids try to wash their dog, hijinks ensued. It wasn't a smash hit, but the shorts were successful enough to keep the company afloat. Their next project was Friends, which saw the Beherens loading up a motorhome and traveling to every state, making 5-minute profiles of interesting kids they discovered along the way. The films were without adult commentary. The kids themselves were introducing themselves. We learn that children, who have been raised on television, have a deep desire to be involved in the process of making a show and being seen. With simple direction, the average alert child has a tremendous ability to communicate on TV. While these short programs were encouraging in their minor success, the Beherens wanted to build on this foundation for a full half-hour program, something they didn't really have the resources or capital to pull off. So, when you can't think big, think thrifty. The Beherens had a lot of connections with local television, and by extension, local news programs, which shot a lot of local interest stories that, after they aired, just sat in a vault somewhere, collecting dust. The Beherens realized, hey, why should this stuff go to waste? What if we took these old news stories, replaced the voiceover with children, and sold it as a kids show? We buy news stories from local stations, then we re-edit, cut in new music, and re-narrate the stories with the voices of children. We pay story fees equal to or greater than any news service. Yes, from the very beginning, Kidsworld was old news. To give the project some legitimacy, the Beherens brought in clinical psychologist Dr. Roger Franceschi, who worked as a consultant for CBS on matters of children's programming. He gave the project a glowing endorsement. This stack of recycled material wasn't just good, it was radical television that could counteract the mindless trends of the networks. The Beherens really had a radical idea in the early 70s, that of having one child talking to another. This was an extraordinary point of view in 1973. The networks were locked into the concept of super kids, of children who could be packaged as stars. They wanted kids who were cloned from Donnie and Marie Osmond. Kidsworld has an entirely different approach, showing real kids describing real experiences. The networks felt that the American public wasn't ready for that. Oh my god, you guys made the Kids Bop version of the 6 o'clock news. Relax. Now, in fairness, this recycling method was only for the first year of the show. Kidsworld managed to sell to 50 markets in 1976, primarily NBC affiliates, and had the funds for more original reporting in the coming years. But the show's thriftiness didn't stop there, as Kidsworld had one of the most flexible syndication agreements around this time. Basically, when your local channel bought the syndication rights to Kidsworld, they could use the show in 3 different ways. First, you could air the show as is. Just plop it in a time slot and enjoy. Second, you were free to cut up episodes and edit segments of it into your channel's local news program. Have a Kidsworld segment and hope to get kids watching the news alongside their parents. Third, every affiliate who bought the syndication package was allowed to change up to 51% of a given episode. Do you want to swap out a given segment for a local child reporter reporting on something local to your area? You can do that. Do you want to completely replace the wraparound anchor segments with Miss Kitty's 6th grade class introing things? You can totally do that. Do you want to double the length of the show to an hour, adding on top of the default episodes? You can do that. Every channel had the option to personalize Kidsworld and make it their own, and have its production be used as a springboard for community projects. For example, the Spokane, Washington version of Kidsworld had a program where participating kids would earn points for working on the show. You attended a staff meeting? There's a point. You have a story suggestion? Point. You worked the camera? Point. Earn enough points, and a kid could get a $50 savings bond. That's right, kids. It's $50 you have to wait 5 years to spend. Thanks for making our TV show for us. This was the real appeal of Kidsworld. It wasn't just a show, but a kit to make your own show. The Beherens even offered classes in Miami on how to run your local Kidsworld production. There's actually a good amount of Kidsworld clips on YouTube, but many of them look very different in style and production value from each other. And this is why. There wasn't just one Kidsworld, but dozens of localized, customized versions of the show across the country. The show also had an open submission policy. Are you a kid and there's something interesting going on in your town? Let us know, and we might loan you a camera so you can report it yourself. We get 2,000 letters a month from kids who want to be reporters. Some of them send gorgeous storyboards and rough scripts. Into those children's hands, we're going to put a Super 8 camera and have them shoot the stories themselves. Basically, Kidsworld was a show built on the idea of getting other people to make the show for you. On one hand, there's a certain cynicism in that, but I suppose it was one of the first true outlets to allow children a hand in making television, and on paper, you can see the appeal of such a project for Nickelodeon. It certainly paralleled Nick's eventual ethos. Except, Kidsworld ceased production of new episodes in 1985, and Nickelodeon aired it in 1990. Nickelodeon would have had to have gotten their hands on the standard syndicated version, not any of the 24 or so local versions. Now, it's possible, like the local networks before them, that Nickelodeon could have customized the episodes in some ways, but there is no way to confirm that until an actual Nick broadcast of the show turns up. And that seems unlikely, because Nickelodeon never intended for kids to watch it during broadcast. They intended for teachers to record it and maybe air it in class, and then have the tape disposed of. Kidsworld was part of Nickelodeon's first dive into cable in the classroom.
The following program is part of Cable in the Classroom, a service of the cable television industry and your local cable company.
Around the end of the 1980s, several companies were trying to figure out if there was a way to intersect cable or satellite television with public schooling. Films had been shown in classrooms since the late 1920s, but these were specific products with specific licenses for schools. Legally, you can't just put anything in front of your students. That would be considered a public performance, an exhibition of a movie outside of a private residence. While that's a hard thing to monitor, companies will often act if they learn of a classroom showing a movie that isn't licensed for curriculum. Back in 2020, Disney tried to find a California elementary school for showing the Lion King remake in class, and only backed off when it became bad PR. This also applies to things recorded off of television, so there may be the perfect documentary for your class airing on A&E, but you can't get your VCR out, record it, and show it to your students. But what if you could? What if there were designated times on designated channels that were automatically licensed for educational use, that teachers were allowed to record from and could use that programming freely. One of the first services to offer this kind of thing was Channel 1 News, a youth news program created by Whittle Communications and premiering in March of 1989. The company would lease out satellite receivers to schools and broadcast the show every weekday before school started, where it would be recorded and then shown as part of the morning activities, usually in homeroom. Aimed at a youth market, it was a pretty straightforward news program, and notably was the starting point for a lot of big names in cable news today like Lisa Ling and Anderson Cooper.
He joins us on our special satellite hookup right now with a report. Anderson, how are you?
I'm doing well, Lisa. Let me tell you what's going on. Despite a few instances over the night and early this morning, sporadic gunfire, the U.S. Marines and UN forces are firmly in control of the city of Mogadishu.
It was also very commercialized. 2 minutes of commercial attached to a 10-minute episode. A very direct way for advertisers to get in front of a captive youth market. You had to watch the commercials. You're a student in class. You had to sit through the Pizza Hut commercials. That's an advertiser's dream. This was controversial from the get-go. It was even banned in California and New York for a time, and prompted counter-programming. The usually blustery Ted Turner condemned it and announced CNN Newsroom, a short-lived 15-minute commercial-free youth news program that would air in the early mornings on CNN that teachers were free to record, premiering on August 14, 1989. And that was just the beginning. There was Assignment Discovery on the Discovery Channel, Electronic Library on the Learning Channel, and the Classroom on A&E, and Short Subjects on C-SPAN, all offering youth-oriented educational and news programming that classrooms had free license to record and air for students. Now that's a lot of stuff floating around. Perhaps we should get a bunch of it under one umbrella.
In front of a class at Edison High School, Boris Yeltsin stood up and changed the course of communism. Magic Johnson gave some tips to Maryville High's basketball team. And Rudolf Nureyev staged the Nutcracker at Lewis F. Cole Middle School. By donating cable service and commercial-free programming to schools across the country, local cable companies like yours are helping teachers show that great things can come to those who dare to dream.
First developed by cable provider Continental Cablevision, Cable in the Classroom was pitched to the Massachusetts State House in September of 1989 as a way to bring all these efforts together. We're committed to education, and we believe, particularly in this time of shrinking budgets, that television, if used properly, can be a valuable teaching tool. The pitch was strongly supported by state educators and children's television advocates like Peggy Sharon, and after a brief pilot program in 5 Massachusetts schools to make sure it worked, Cable in the Classroom began a slow national rollout in November of 1989, with management oversight run by the National Cable and Telecommunications Association, or NCTA. The service provided free cable hookups to grade schools who signed up. This wasn't technically necessary. All the shows still aired on regular cable. You didn't need a special receiver dish like Channel 1 News, so a teacher could record the programs at their own home and bring them to class. But Cable in the Classroom provided convenience and up-to-date information on what shows had these special educator use licenses. By the end of 1989, Cable in the Classroom serviced just over 6,000 schools. By 1994, it was servicing 64,663 schools, roughly 65% of all grade schools in the United States. It made sense for Nickelodeon to get in on this. A nice slab of good PR without much effort on their part. Just an hour of commercial-free television a day. And during hours where most people aren't watching anyway. Peggy Sharon seemed to love the concept, and Nickelodeon had started to lose favor with her, so something like this could help patch up relations. Now it was just a matter of picking the shows. Mr. Wizard's World made total sense. It offered lessons in science that teachers could also replicate in the classroom. That would be on weekdays. On Sundays, Nickelodeon also offered episodes of Eureka's Castle and Kids Court, presumably for preschoolers and social studies classes, respectively. Which leaves Kidsworld, the odd one out. the only show offered to cable in the classroom that wasn't a Nickelodeon original, and one that was weirdly out of date. Surely there was something in the archives that was more appropriate. Nobody cared about Against the Odds when it first aired, but it's still some decent historical documentaries, and Bill Bixby was still alive, so it's not like seeing him on screen would have been a bummer yet. However, I think this was a case of Nickelodeon trying to chase trends. Remember, cable in the classroom came into being mostly as a middle finger to Channel 1 News, and most of the early programs offered by the service were alternative children's news shows. Now, Nickelodeon didn't have one of those yet, but perhaps they could license something similar from syndication and present it that way. I have no means of confirming this. There's no press release saying as such, but I believe that Kidsworld was an attempt for the channel to fit into the cable in the classroom's ethos. Let's get a children's news show like the rest of them are doing so we can get into the program, and then we can offload a bunch of our originals along with it, including this children's puppet show that we're selling a lot of merch for. Kidsworld really isn't a Nickelodeon show. I mean, it aired on Nickelodeon, yes, so technically it counts and it gets a Knacks episode, but they didn't care if any of their young audience saw it. It was never for them. It was to get in with the teachers and the larger classroom programs. Nickelodeon would stick with cable in the classroom for many years to come, with shows like Launchbox, Nick News, and Dora the Explorer being offered through the program. Kidsworld would air its last on the channel on January 3rd, 1992, without anybody really realizing it was there at all. Neither Cable in the Classroom or Channel 1 News would survive into the internet streaming era, with easy-peasy downloads replacing the need for cable or satellite recordings. Cable in the Classroom would be discontinued in 2014, and Channel 1 News would close its door in 2018. Kidsworld is the most footnote of a show we've talked about so far in Knacks, a program created with as little effort as possible, years out of date and collecting dust, then put in a dead time slot to buy into America's newest educational initiative and maybe make Jerry Laybourne and Peggy Sharon BFFs again. I feel like I'm missing something here. Maybe Nickelodeon did add a bunch of new stuff to it and it's not as weird and lazy as it sounds. But without an actual recording of the Nickelodeon broadcast, there's just no way to confirm that. On paper, Kidsworld just seems like an afterthought.
Nick, 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 Nickelodeon. Nick, 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 Nickelodeon.
Next time, Nickelodeon tries the summer airing of old sitcoms thing again, but will this be another My Three Sons or another Mr. Ed? Today's research shout-out goes to the Internet Archive, which has a substantial collection of trade magazines, including those for television production, offering a lot of insight into the production of Kidsworld. Actually, the Internet Archive is a cornerstone of all my research, and is currently being sued for basically being a library. Let's cross our fingers it doesn't get shut down. Thank you all for watching. If you'd like to support Knacks and other Pop Arena projects, consider contributing to my Patreon. Every dollar goes to production values, research materials, and Brussels sprouts. Look, fry them in some butter and you are having a great time. You can also support the channel by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, hitting that bell icon for notifications, following me on Twitter, sending a one-time donation through PayPal or Coffee, and sharing knickknacks with all your friends. I'll see you later, and Black Lives Matter.